China has been historically the most powerful nation-state in Asian history, throughout the thousands of years of its existence in various forms, both politically and socially. Various regions of Asia have been under its rule by extension through administration, tributary subjugation, and vassalage. All regions will be discussed, from north of China to south of China, east of China, and west of China. In ancient times, northern Asia was unknown to the Chinese. Some accounts had it that the land was barren and cold, windswept plateaus that never ended. The consensus were that to the north of the Han Chinese occupied lands, the nomadic Mongolian barbarians lived, but beyond even where they lived were supposedly endless grassland tundra that continued voidlessly for eternity. Humans have lived within the region for thousands of years, yet in Chinese historical legends, the Yonggu Confederation, a semi-mythical alliance of nomadic peoples, controlled the region. In one of these legendary wars, it waged a conflict against the Han Dynasty and lost. The Chinese recorded within their records of a quote-unquote huge sea and called it the North Sea from their mythologies, of the northernmost point where Chinese can venture to or live within. This was considered the northernmost point of China to the ancient Chinese dynasties and what is now considered to be Lake Baikal, and it was informally claimed by China for thousands of years. But due to the lake being so extraordinarily far from proper Chinese administrative or military control, the lake and regions surrounding it gradually shifted away from Chinese claims or intention, and with Imperial Chinese focused on closer regions to govern or control, the claim of the Northern Sea was abandoned. The situation was made further hopeless for China to reassert its ancient claims to the region when the Mongolians would often reside within it. The Chinese did not want to deal with the Mongolians, as they have throughout history, especially with relation to controlling a region, and from the 1600s onwards, the Russians would formally claim the lands that the ancient Chinese once occupied. The Altai Urankai refer to a Mongolian tribe that lives in northern Asia. These nomadic peoples were under sporadic rule of various warring factions, but only until modern times were they considered under specific administration. The first examples of Chinese rule came from the mid-1400s when the Yuan dynasty brought somewhat the region within its control. But once the dynasty collapsed, the Mongolian Chinese dynasty relinquished control of the region. In the 1700s, the Qing dynasty sought to bring back the region under Chinese administration and keep the area under its control until Chinese influence weakened in the 1800s, and the region was slowly and discreetly colonized by Russia and officially lost to China in the early 1900s. It's also interesting to notice that in modern times, the Chinese government hasn't exactly renounced claims to the region. Even though it's formally under Russian administration, China does seek to someday reclaim the region when it becomes militarily strong enough. What's now considered Manchuria is historically slightly less than half of what China has inhabited and governed throughout the centuries. This region in particular has had rich Chinese history and is often mentioned as being fully Chinese under temporary Russian administration. The region in question has always had some sort of Chinese presence, but the minority ethnic group of the Manchurians have called the region its homeland. Even though it's not technically Han Chinese by region, the lands were under nearly every dynasty's control as mentioned. It has been depicted thus so in various dynastical maps. But during the Qing dynasty, the Manchurians didn't want the Han Chinese to settle their homelands, and further during the dynasty, Han emigration to the region was almost forbidden. As a result of the lack of population and urban development, the Russians would encroach into the region, and during China's weakness in the 1800s, the entire region was lost as a result. A geographical estimate is that the entire land lost by China to Russia is roughly considered that of modern-day Spain. Within mainland Chinese schools, the region is often taught to children as being Chinese, and even names of Chinese origin for cities, landmarks, rivers, mountains, and various other locations are taught by their ancient names, not their modern Russian titles. It's theorized that when the time comes for China to reclaim lost lands from foreign powers, this region will be among the first due in part to the crowded northern Chinese regions and sparsely administrated Russian settlements in Manchuria. Even by Manchurian or Mongolian extents, the island by the modern name of Sakhalin was underdeveloped and sparsely populated. Despite the fact that the island was geographically the same to Manchuria, not the Strait of Tartary, it's just roughly 7 kilometers apart from mainland Asia, it was still neglected by Mongolian and Manchurian interests. Accounts for the Mongols and Manchu have it that the native tribes inhabited the island, but there was no serious interest or attention from Mongol or Chinese acquisitional claims of the island, as they were not made until roughly the 1200s with the Yuan dynasty. Throughout the mid-1200s to early 1800s, the Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties have had sporadic outposts in Manchuria to have connections to the Sakhalin for trade with the natives of fur and other natural resources. However, due to the situations that the Qing had to contend with during the mid to late 1700s, with Russian advancement through northern Asia, the claims that the Mongols in Qing had to the Sakhalin were slowly ignored on Russian interests in the island. Even the entire region, as mentioned, began to strengthen. The Japanese were also modernizing and considering the Sakhalin to be a geographical extension of Hokkaido, and strengthened their interests there as well. In the mid-1800s, the Qing was forced to officially renounce claims to the island, as the Russian and Japanese governments would later argue between the both of them as to who was the real political or legal entity to govern the island. Despite the island being under Russian administration, the population is very small, and there are very real theories that Japan will someday retake the island due to it being so geographically close to Japanese territory, and the fact that the Russians cannot necessarily defend such a distant region. In ancient times, even through dynastic times and up until the present, the notion of a Mongolian nation or geographical region to the Chinese wasn't believed. Chinese claims of land north of what was normally considered to be Chinese land were accepted as an extension of China itself, and Mongolians simply resided upon these distant Han lands. This is why sporadic Chinese militaristic excursions into the north of China proper occurred throughout history. As mentioned, Lake Baikal is the northernmost point of Chinese land, so Mongolia was technically Chinese in at least terms of territory. With the Qing dynasty collapse in 1911, the newly formed Republic of China immediately declared all Mongolian lands to be Chinese administered and Chinese owned, owing to the ancient notion that though there were Mongolians to the north, the land was essentially Chinese, but due in part to the new Chinese Republic being militaristically and diplomatically weak, an independent Mongolian nation was declared, and some of these lands were later lost from China and assigned to Mongolia. But the Chinese kept the territory of Mongolia small on purpose, for the time when someday it would be reclaimed by a future Chinese political entity. This is one of the reasons why modern China, it administers Inner Mongolia, as the independent nation of Mongolia is sometimes called Outer Mongolia by Chinese officials. A weak Mongolia is beneficial to China, as for thousands of years the nomadic Mongolians were often a problem for various dynastic establishments to contend with. Throughout history, the modern region of Sikkim, administered by India, was historically part of Tibet. even though the name or title of Sikkim was actually that of a minor kingdom. But in terms of political or geographical clout, it was considered part of Greater Tibet by the imperial Indian and dynastic Chinese governments. In the 1800s, with most of India being under that of British control, there were attempts at setting up a border between British-held Indian territory as well as Chinese-held Tibetan territory. Through circumstances, all of Sikkim was put under Indian control, while China was diplomatically and militaristically unable to do much about this fact. Geographically small compared to other regions lost, it's still officially claimed by modern China in terms of maps. In the late 1800s, British officials administering the Indian regions along the Himalayan region noticed that key village trading posts were within Tibetan territory. Since Tibet was controlled by China, the notion was to bring these villages within the Indian sphere of influence and that of the British Crown. With Qing China weakened, the British drew a borderline along the region. This border was later called the McMahon Line, after the main diplomatic official responsible for it. This border was highly controversial within the Chinese in the fact that a large region of Tibet would essentially be taken from Chinese control to Indian administration. Within India, this region is called Arunachal Pradesh, but the Chinese usually call it South Tibet due to the historical Tibetan ties with local communities. In modern times, the Chinese government has acknowledged the line, but does maintain a claim to the entire region. According to ancient Chinese mythology, the South China Sea was the Great Southern Sea, with the North Sea being that of Lake Baikal. The South China Sea was the southernmost point of indisputable Chinese territory, and due to the southern coast of China having some of the most ancient provinces of all Chinese dynastic history, the islands within the sea have been claimed, owned, and occupied to various extents by nearly every dynasty, and have been depicted within various texts throughout China's vast history. The islands were not exactly habitable for large amounts of people. Essentially, they were just markers in the ocean that the Chinese would use for their ships to sail from regions in southern China to other regions in Southeast Asia, being that of the modern Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The fact that nearly all, or if not all of the islands, were Chinese mostly due in part to China being dynastically the strongest country in Asia, and their claims were not spoken against. If China owned one or multiple islands in the South China Sea, other nations did not dare to object such claims. But in modern times, nearly all of the Southeast Asian nations have some sort of claim to various islands in the sea. Notably, Vietnam, due to a good number of the islands being just off the coast of the Southeast Asian country, or within its sphere of influence. Even against Vietnam, China in recent times has put an increased focus onto the ancient Southern Sea claims, and has made it internationally clear that it wants the islands back, and with proof or no proof will ruthlessly keep them if the government has to. What modern Vietnam considers to be its firm territory has actually in ancient times been administered by China itself. Records from Guangxi and Guangdong have both accounts that the region of northern Vietnam, in particular bordering China, were administered by Chinese dynasties. The Han Dynasty has had a region called Southern Viet, and the region had claims to what is now modern Vietnam. However, due to history in the region, it developed its own distinct culture and identity, and only has distinct connections to China. The culture in the bordering regions to China of Vietnam still have many aspects of culture, language, and even genealogies among the people who live in the region, due to the thousands of years of intermarriage of Vietnamese and Chinese between villages and settlements. The border between northern Burma and southern China has always been somewhat vague in terms of which region is exactly Chinese and which region is exactly Burmese. Villages of various nationalities along the border were often considered to be Chinese or Burmese, on whichever side of the border that they happened to settle on, and it wasn't until the Ming Dynasty that the borders were somewhat made official in the late 1300s. In particular, the Kachin state has had much Chinese influence over the centuries, and the Qing Dynasty decided to have a tighter control in mind with managing of the Yunnan province's border regions in the early 1700s. With the Burmese dynasty noticing the Qing's claims to the north, in the mid-1700s they reasserted claims of their own. On through wars, the Qing were actually repelled and Burma's independence from Chinese meddling was reassured. The defeat of China by Burma was considered one of the few examples of militaristic defeats prior to the 1800s decline of Imperial China, and these wars against China and these victories against China are often celebrated in Burma even in modern times. The modern border between China and Burma are reflective of these border disputes and wars in the 1700s, but in modern times there is increased activity from China on the Yunnan side of the border, and Chinese migrants have often ventured across the border into Burma from China for various reasons. Some of the earliest records mentioning the islands come from Chinese documents from the early 1400s. Chinese vessels would actually use the uninhabited islands as markers on their ways to modern Okinawa for trade and other endeavors. But due to the islands having no real value or importance, they were assumed to be Chinese and no other foreign power laid claim to these islands for centuries. Due to the islands being so geographically far from Japan, there were no real claims at all from the Japanese governmental point of view or administrational standard until the late 1800s, when the Imperial Chinese government started to address the islands with the British or American names. With an official annexation of the islands in 1895 as an extension of Okinawa, which itself was a formerly independent nation. In modern times, China has become increasingly assertive of former island claims off its coast, and due to the circumstances China held endured by the Japanese government in the 1800s and 1900s, these islands in particular have been the focus of Chinese attention, due to the Japanese hesitation to develop the islands in case they're seized by the Chinese, which is why there is almost little to no sort of infrastructure on them. Okinawa was a very small independent kingdom just off the coast of China, and due to the geographical location of these islands, they were very much in contact and trade with the various Chinese dynasties. The Okinawan royals made formal requests from the Imperial Chinese court for increased communication and help with development. So, from the 1400s through the 1800s, through connections with the Ming and Qing dynasties, Chinese emigrated to the island and intermarried with the locals. Due to the decline of the Qing in the late 1800s, the Japanese would officially annex the islands in the late 1800s. Due to the complex situation that the Japanese government has had with administering the islands politically, the Chinese government has increased focus on possibly pressuring the Japanese government to grant Okinawa its independence, to weaken Japanese influence in the region. Historically, the border of Korea with China has been contested by different Chinese dynasties and neighboring Korean kingdoms throughout the centuries. Despite the fact that the modern border was roughly set since the mid-1400s, it wasn't until the early 1700s through the late 1800s that a literal border was officially drawn on maps and legally established or administered from both sides of the border. The Yalu and Tumen rivers essentially form the modern border between that of Korea and China. Historically, Chinese influence and even settlement have gone somewhat further south than these natural river borders, as dynastic maps of the border between that of Korea and China prior to the Qing dynasty actually shows somewhat different borders, with Chinese territories slightly further south into Korea, but were essentially the same. Due to the political situations between China and Korea in the 1800s, the border was officially set at the river regions because it was somewhat easier to manage politically. Historically associated with Tibet, the region has actually been under Tibetan rule or influence for centuries. However, starting from the late 1300s and through the early 1500s, Muslim influence seeped into the region, and though it kept a Tibetan influence, there would be a clearly Islamic presence and eventual Indian influence as well. In the early 1800s, the region was formally annexed into the Sikh Empire and later British administration. However, the Chinese did not forget the Tibetan claims to Lakta, and in the early 1960s, China waged a small war against India and was victorious as the Iskai Chin region was seized by Chinese forces. It's seen by some analysts as a possible stepping stone to possibly someday retake Lakta. When the Qing dynasty was established in the mid-1600s, it embarked on the grand plan to reacquire all western regions that had been within the sphere of influence of every prior dynasty. Owing to the political instability of the region at the time, the Qing actually expanded the western borders of the empire further than any other dynasty to have come before it. The western border of China was pushed all the way into what is now Central Asia. Lake Balagash was considered the northwesternmost boundary of the empire and remained within the Chinese sphere of influence for centuries. It wasn't until the Qing dynasty weakened in the mid-1800s that it was officially ceded to Russia in 1864, along with the surrounding region. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the lake and region became Eastern Kazakhstan. In modern times, the Chinese hasn't exactly forgotten the Qing dynasty claim to the lake and surrounding regions. In the early 2000s, the Kazakhstani government actually released a report mentioning that there were claims that the region was somewhat polluted in part due to the Chinese consumption of the water from the lake and its smaller tributaries. The Kazakhstani government actually proposed a price cut of Kazakh products to China in exchange for a reduction in the amount of water consumed from the region, but the request was denied by China, due in part to the western regions of China needing such water in order to safely function. It's theorized that the Chinese might someday demand a more proactive role in the region due to the scarce resources that the Chinese western regions might need. In the 1600s to 1800s, with the Qing dynasty seeking to expand its reach further west than any other dynasty had done so before it, it sought advantage of the situation in Central Asia with regional kingdoms. In what's now modern Kyrgyzstan was completely within Chinese control. But due to the extraordinary remoteness of the region, the native peoples only had nominal Chinese interactions or assimilation. When Lake Balagash and the surrounding areas were ceded by Qing China to Russia, what is now modern Kyrgyzstan was essentially part of that area. In particular, the Isysk-Kul region, which is roughly the eastern region of Kyrgyzstan, was formerly incorporated into Russia along with Lake Balagash. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the region gained independence as Kyrgyzstan. Despite the fact that in modern times, the Chinese government hasn't necessarily placed interest in retrieving the formerly Qing areas of what is now Kyrgyzstan, there has been consistent governmental focus by China on Kyrgyzstani regions in the late 1990s and early 2000s due to the tumultuous situation in the country and the fact that ethnic tensions might transfer from Kyrgyzstan into the politically sensitive Xinjiang region that China still controls and China has problems with.